Hello, everybody. I'm Will Tagle, Dean of the School of Graduate Study. This is the Great Books series. Today, we're considering one of the more important persons of the modern era. I'm speaking to you today from the hill country, the beautiful hill country of Texas. It's about 75 degrees. I can smell the flowers that are blooming near where I'm speaking. I bring this up because for Einstein, his place in nature became, as we shall see, the most important feature of his life. It's also a feature that he himself overlooked in his autobiography because he was speaking to us mainly in numbers. Isaacson also seemed to overlook this feature of his life. So throughout these two presentations, we'll look underneath and see this important and defining dimension of his life. Einstein is important beyond what mainstream history thinks. And the mainstream thinks a lot of Albert Einstein. Picture in your mind an arc of a circle that reaches back to Abraham, Buddha, Jesus, and post-Socratic Greece. Out of the confluence of these great rivers and other tributaries came the civilization into which Albert was born. His native Germany fostered an outward arc on civilization's circle, an arc that emphasized the rational capacities of the individual. A civilization that said man is the measure of all things. A civilization of mainstream patriarchy. A civilization where humans were and are split off from the natural order. A civilization where science reduced all of reality to the material world and thus became an unofficial religion. A civilization that glorified critical rational capacities and delegated creativity and intuition to the back of the bus. A civilization that has run amok, finally run amok, and fouled our global nest. But at the end of that 19th century, the evolutionary impulse turned the arc of the circle of cultural evolution back toward its beginning point. More than any other human of that era, Einstein embodied the dawning of a new epistemology. With him, the circle bends back toward what? Toward a mother tongue. With him, we climb down the stairs of the Tower of Babel to that point where all humans can speak one language, a language underneath all languages, a language of entangled hierarchy, a language of discontinuous creativity, and a language of non-locality. I will propose in these two lectures that Einstein opened the door to a new way of perceiving reality, to a possible great return of humans to the natural order. Yes, he opened the door, took a few courageous steps into the future, and then strangely froze in his own footsteps. What I speak about in these two teachings consists of my dreams, my meditations and my reflections on major moments in his life. Major moments, yes. But beyond that, I will seek to tease out a pattern often overlooked by mainstream historians of science. Overlooked because modern historians tend to have their eyes clouded by the paradigm in which we live and move and have our being. In this sense, I am not lecturing on Einstein's autobiography or even Isaacson's biography. Rather, I am looking beneath both of those resources to the soil out of which both of these books grow, aided by the compost of my own dreams, meditations, and reflections. Let's begin with a major development in his young life. In today's diagnostic language, Einstein was a so-called delayed speaker. Some biographers support that Einstein started talking late, while others that say that it is simply one of the many myths that grew up around him. But one historian I found said, quote, Einstein definitely did not speak until he was 4 years old, and he didn't read a word until he was 7. Walter Isaacson biography of Einstein states that he formed, listen to this, strange words at age 2. And that he had a mild form of something called echolalia, causing him to repeat phrases to himself. Oddly, Isaacson chose to ignore Einstein's family archives. I found that his family members were firm in their observation that he was a reluctant talker. I like that term, a reluctant talker, and said little except a few, and this is the word of one of his family members, a few garbled words until his 4th year. Note that the description of, quote, garbled betrays the bias of a civilization that little understood this reluctance to speak in usual ways to usual humans. But I want to bring this up. Was he communicating with forces not available in ordinary states of consciousness to most adults? Let's explore this a little further, because I think it's really, really important. Developmental psychology tells us that most children have a vocabulary of 50 words by age 2. By age 3, a normal child can be fully understood by caregivers with a vocabulary of 450 words. And by age 4, it's expected that a child will have a vocabulary of over 1,000 words, easily understandable to the external world. It's apparent then that in today's world, Einstein would be seen likely to have a behavioral and emotional problem and would likely be located somewhere on the Asperger's autism continuum, sometimes called the autistic spectrum of disorders. Luckily for us, for all of us, diagnosticians did not get their hands on him, though he did suffer a negativity from his educators and from many members of his family. But let's get imaginatively inside of the child Einstein, just for a moment. While there are many disadvantages to a late talker, there are also, shall we say, rich possibilities. Perhaps he had a large vocabulary, but one that appeared garbled to his culture. Perhaps he was talking to the unseen world. And modern speech specialists saw that talking as echolalia. They saw that he was speaking only to himself. But what if he was not speaking only to himself? As a late speaker, Einstein likely developed a relationship with the natural world, a much deeper one because of his not communicating with the human world. As a late speaker, he likely observed both functional and dysfunctional patterns in his family and also in his culture. He likely developed a dimension of his brain, a dimension that saw gestalts, patterns, and unseen realities. Freed of the frontal cortex and its occupation with speaking, his brain could roam into dreamlike states that put him outside his culture. He likely observed nuances with grasses, trees, soils, rocks, stars, and other creatures who became his intimate friends. We know he mumbled, in a language not understandable probably to you and me or to his family, because that is recorded clearly in the family archives. But was he communicating, as I said before, in an unknown mother tongue, often overshadowed by the adult critical reasoning surrounding him? His was a world free of many human creations. His was a world where his condition set the stage for the contribution that he was to make. Did this situation allow him to enter possibility waves not available to more traditionally achieving children? Well, I have to pause here and just say that I have a friend that I talked to over the last 20 years once a week, and I read to him what I just said to you. He's a colleague and one of the leading therapists in the Northeast. And he said to me, Will, your sensitivity to Einstein's unusual speaking condition is likely supported by the fact that you yourself didn't speak until well into your 4th year. So, in the interest of transparency, I note that I might idealize Einstein's not speaking as a way to justify my own tardy language development. It is true that I had not been talking long when I began school just a few days after my 6th birthday. The main thing I recall about my slow entry into civilization is how rich it was not to speak to humans for 4+ years. A few nights ago, in a transpersonal state, I engaged many pleasant memories of that pre-verbal period. Likely one of the most important educational experiences of my life. True, a profound grief arose in these memories as I experienced putting on shoes to attend school. The shoes seemed to squash my creativity and block my digging my toes into rich dirt. I can recall being in a parallel world in the first few elementary grades. There was the domain of the teacher and my classmates. There was a sense that something was going on, but the big show for me was going on outside the windows, out in the trees and the grass and the clouds. and that these images would reach in through the windows and grab me and shake me like a passion. And sometimes I would tremble, and the teacher would come over and put her hand on my back to quiet me. Answers in class discussion often came from this place of dreams and imagination outside the class. And lucky for me, my early teachers, Mrs. Smith, would respect my process. Mrs. Grace, Mrs. Short, those names are just now coming to me. It seemed to me as if I was witnessing the social and educational scene from a distance, a dream-like distance, and it imparted to me a fierce questioning of reality. I can only imagine that this might also have been the case with Albert Einstein, though, of course, he was touched with a brilliance beyond my grasp. Certainly, Albert would be known for his own fierce questioning, especially of German authority. So much so that as a very young man, he renounced his German citizenship and challenged, as a part of this renouncing and as a part of his questioning, he challenged the very foundations of his scientific establishment, as we'll soon see. Okay, so now let's move on. A childhood compass. One day in his early boyhood, when Albert was sick in bed, his father brought him a compass, a small round case with a magnetic needle inside. No matter which way Albert turned the compass, the needle always pointed north, as if held by an invisible hand. That's a term that he used later. The compass seemed to be moving with some invisible hand. Albert was so amazed by the compass that his body trembled, and perhaps his father put his hand on Albert's back the way my first grade teacher had with me. Albert's imagination was fired by curiosity. Like the father of modern economic theory, Adam Smith, Einstein would then spend a lifetime searching for the powers of the invisible hand. Hearing a locomotive. In my freshman year in college, a friend of mine, Charles Kerb, and I attempted to understand the special theory of relativity and how it grew out of Einstein's childhood. We sought to understand by constructing through our own imaginations one of Einstein's famous thought experiments. We researched the history of locomotives, which in Einstein's childhood were still something of an oddity. We could see Einstein sitting on the hillside, and off to his left was the train, the locomotive coming, and it made a sound off in the distance. And then as it came in front of him, and then as it disappeared off to this direction, so it went, and Einstein, who was accustomed to horses and buggies, to him, this was an amazing, amazing experience, because he began to form this notion that sound is relative to where you are sitting. High school dropout and nature hiking. While he was still an adolescent, Einstein's family moved to Italy and left him in Germany to continue his school. After some time, he was homesick and finally decided to move and join his family. So he dropped out of school. Now take note, one historian I read said, hey, Albert Einstein was a high school dropout. After he dropped out of school, he hiked a good portion of the way from the south of Germany through the Alps, the Italian Alps, until he reached his destination. The hiking through the mountains, I would assume, from reading deeply in his material, left a lasting imprint on his imagination. In some ways, this deep connection with landscape would be prominent in the birthing of the special theory of relativity, as we shall soon see. We can only wonder, too, what his parents' response was when he arrived in Italy as a high school dropout, having hitchhiked and hiked across the Alps. His father, Hermann, had plans for Albert to be an engineer, which Hermann thought would be the paramount profession of the 20th century. Luckily for Albert, the school that Hermann wanted his son to attend, the Swiss Polytechnic Institute in Zurich, did not require a high school diploma, but instead required a series of rigorous entrance exams. This was very good news, except for one fact. Albert flunked most of the exams. After he failed the equivalent of our GED, he started reading Immanuel Kant's Die Kritik der reinen Vernunft, the critique of pure reason. This is a very important moment in his life. And we'll see in my next lecture how Spinoza also became defining in his life. But for Kant, for Albert Einstein, Kant was a defining philosopher. Because not only was Kant saying in his critique of pure reason that reality cannot be grasped fully or even significantly through what we call critical thinking. Not only was he saying that, he was saying that humans cannot know what he called, and Einstein was completely shaken by this phrase, you cannot know, das Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Now, Kant went on to say you could know only one thing. You can know intuitively the categorical moral imperative. Einstein wasn't sure about that, but eventually he would be sure that in fact the most basic building block of the universe is motion itself. More and more, Einstein was coming to trust his imagination and his intuition in what he called, and they became famous, thought experiments. One day, while riding his bicycle at the age of 16, Einstein gazed at the rays of sunlight beaming from the sun to the earth and wondered what would it be like to ride on a beam of light. Over and over again, he transported himself into that fantasy. It was the biggest and most exciting thought Albert had ever had to that moment. And it filled his mind with a series of questions. And by the way, speaking of series of questions, if you'll consult your chat box, there are a series of questions that I've put in the chat box for you to contemplate for our discussion. But don't go to them right now because I want you to listen to what I'm saying. And so these are some of the questions that Albert came up with. If the motion or speed of light is independent of the motion of the system or the source, then light will fill the room at the speed of light. Such a thought flew in the face of the physics of his day. In one of his classrooms, he spoke of riding the sunbeams to his teachers. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and note that in the same way that Einstein's family members, when he was pre-verbal, they thought he was speaking in a garbled language, so his physics professors thought he was speaking in strange and an unknown tongue when he was talking about light and motion. They laughed at him. They laughed at his riding on a beam of light. And they said to him something like this: Albert, Albert, consider throwing a ball with a given force. The ball will travel at a specific distance based on the initial force. If, however, Albert, you are running at some speed, the ball will travel further than if you threw it while at rest. In fact, the speed of the ball will be the sum of the speed you throw it from rest and the speed at which you're running. This addition, or subtraction if you're running backwards, of speeds is the fundamental law of motion given to us by Sir Isaac Newton. And Albert, are you saying that you know more than Isaac Newton? Every physicist knows, they said, this fundamental law of motion. His teacher sat back and smiled indulgently, smugly at Einstein, thinking they had put him in his place. But Albert continued to question by imaginatively projecting himself onto the beam of light. Over and over and over, he repeated the experiment. And he concluded that the speed of light one measures when the source is at rest is the same number no matter how or where it is measured. If you are moving toward a light ray, the measured speed is the same as when measured at rest. The same applies if you're moving away from a light ray. Always the same number. He didn't know what the number was, but eventually he would discover that it was 186,290 miles per second. Einstein went on to argue with his teachers using this example. He said to them, if I turn on a flashlight while I'm running, the beam of light is emitted at the same speed no matter how fast I go. This is strange. This is a strange way for something to move, I admit. It's an action that surely does not apply to the example you gave me of throwing a ball. I admit that, he said. But I postulate that light acts differently from matter. And this may be viewed as an absolute point of view, since the speed of light is the same value in all systems. Behaving so, light takes on the nature of being an invariant quality. This also meant that the speed of light has the status of a universal principle, thus fulfilling what you read when you read Einstein's autobiography. And I will talk next month about how this absolutist point of view about the speed of light kept Einstein from moving further into the newer sciences. But now let's skip ahead to his graduate works. Thoughts like this particular writing of a light beam stayed with him. They would not let him go. They were his magnificent obsession. And finally, at the turn of the 20th century, Einstein found himself embroiled once again in a controversy with mainstream physicists, even as he had fought valiantly with his high school and college teachers. The principal players in his controversy were a man named Paul Drude and Ludwig Boltzmann. Both of these men held that the universe was a closed system, that the classical physics of Isaac Newton completely covered the ground of material reality, which in their way of thinking was the only reality. Boltzmann in particular insisted that atoms, like little tiny ball bearings, were the basis of all reality. And he made clear that Einstein's thought experiments concerning the motion and speed of light were science fiction. Plus, his doctoral advisor, H.F. Weber, believed that Einstein did not have an idea in his head that was original. In fact, Weber told Einstein, quote, "There is very little left for you to discover in the subject of physics, since Newtonian physics covers the subject completely." Weber tried to divert Einstein from further study and recommended that he pursue his father's profession of engineering. By 1902, Einstein had changed dissertation advisors and transferred to the University of Zurich, where he also ran into stiff opposition to his topic. Exasperated, he wrote to a friend these words, quote, "This has become a whole comedy, and the whole thing is tiresome to me, and I'm thinking of giving it up." But in July of 1905, he finished, at long last, his dissertation. Now get this, that was July. Just 2 months later, on September 26th, 1905, Albert Einstein published his Annus Mirabilis paper on what is now called special relativity. He was just 26 years of age. Incidentally, as a footnote, Ludwig Boltzmann, one of the leading physicists of his day, who had opposed Einstein's theory, 1 year after Einstein published his special theory, Boltzmann hanged himself in a fit of depression. Some historians state that Boltzmann couldn't face the startling nature, the startling version of Einstein's universe. Maybe not. But his death does demonstrate how difficult it is for the prevailing paradigm to open itself to the new, and how painful it is for any of us to let go of whatever cosmic map we're holding on to with the force of our life, trying to protect ourselves from what is unfolding in our midst that we refuse to see because it would force us out of our patterns that we so dearly hold. It is a strange paradox that we spend thousands and thousands of dollars on degrees and research, and to finally, at long last, develop a confidence in whatever map we have constructed. Then along comes the evolutionary impulse, asking us to let go and step through another door into a strange world that contradicts what we have come to believe is true. We are in such a moment as that at this time, are we not? Is not the evolutionary impulse reaching in through the windows, shaking us like a passion? The way the trees and the soil and the clouds reached into the classroom when I was in the first grade and shook me like a passion. Are we not at this moment experiencing something similar? And do we not resist with every bone, every muscle in our body that which is becoming apparent? Now let's look closer at the special theory of relativity, which explains how to interpret motion between different inertial frames of reference. That is, places that are moving at constant speed relative to each other. For example, if you and some astronaut are moving in two different spaceships and want to compare your observations, all that matters is how fast you and your companion astronauts are moving with respect to each other. Special relativity includes only the special case, that's the reason it has the name, only the special case where motion is uniform. The motion explained is only if you are traveling in a straight line at a constant speed. As soon as you accelerate or curve or do anything that changes the nature of motion in any way, special relativity ceases to apply. That's where Einstein's general theory of relativity comes in, because it can explain general cases of any sort of motion. And next month, we'll look at the general theory of relativity. Okay, Einstein's special theory of relativity has two characteristics. The first postulate of special relativity is this: observers can never detect uniform motion except relative to other objects. This postulate somehow coincides with a common experience many of us have had. When you sit in a train waiting for it to take off, and the train on the adjacent track starts to move, there are sometimes a few moments when you are not sure whether the train is moving. It is only after you see your absence of motion with respect to the background objects that you realize that the other train is moving and you are not. But if you are at rest or you are moving at a constant velocity in deep space, and you see another spaceship pass by, moving at a constant velocity, you would not be able to tell which spaceship is really moving. This means that there is no such thing as absolute rest. Everything is relative. Another way to say this is that the laws of physics do not distinguish between observers moving at a constant velocity with respect to each other. It means that we live in a universe where there are no fixed things. The second postulate of special relativity, unlike the velocity of massive objects, the speed of light is constant, and is the same for all observers, independent of their constant velocity toward or away from light. The genius of Einstein's discovery is that he looked at his experiments regarding motion and assumed that his thought experiments and his math were accurate. This was the exact opposite of what other physicists and his professors seemed to be doing. Einstein's dissertation advisor and other prominent scientists assumed that their current theory was correct and that Einstein's thought experiments and math, no matter how convincing, had to be in error. On the other hand, Einstein assumed that his intuitive thought experiments and math were correct, and the prevailing theory of motion as enunciated by Sir Isaac Newton was no longer useful, at least in the broadest sense. He saw that the mainstream map did not fit the territory of his vision. Here, this 2-month-old PhD from a second-rate university was challenging the foundations of classical physics. Ultimately, the door he opened to a new view of reality challenged and continues to challenge the very foundations of Western civilization. So much so that even today, in most physics classes across our globe, the mathematics of special relativity are taught. The implications of special relativity still remain obscure because the implications cause us to question the very basis of reality. Let's go further. Why has the world over a whole century been so resistant to this theory? 2 reasons. First, and this is very important, special relativity created a fundamental link between space and time. The universe can be viewed as having 3 space dimensions: up and down, left and right, forward and back. Time has 1 dimension. This presents us with a universe that has 4 dimensions, and that universe is said to have a space-time continuum. What? What? Space and time merge into one? Is somehow the front yard or the backyard where you are and your stopwatch, are they somehow so intricately interrelated that thinking of them separately is an illusion? Here's the second reason that we resist the world that his theory shows us. 1905 was indeed a miracle year. When Einstein applied the theory of special relativity, he came up with the famous equation, E equals mc squared. This represents, of course, the relationship between matter, or mass, and energy. Until Einstein's thought experiments, the concepts of mass and energy were viewed by the world as completely separate, at least in Western civilization. Let me hit the pause button here for a moment to see how important this equation is in the return of humans to the natural order. It can be argued that for nearly 5,000 years, mainline European civilization, that is, European civilization that grew out of the Abraham religions and post-Socratic Greek philosophy, over that period of time, matter and energy have been split. There was no link. In such a civilization, humans themselves are split off from nature. Humans over here, nature over there. So you're there in your home, wherever you live, and if you're going on a camping trip, ordinarily you might say, I'm going out into nature. This fundamental split. Along this line, I've always seen schizophrenia, which literally means split mind, as an extreme form of the madness of our prevailing civilization. In fact, in my early days as a psychotherapist, I had a heavy caseload that included a considerable number of folks who had managed to get themselves labeled as schizophrenics. I came to believe that the symptoms of such an illness were related to all of our being split from nature, split from the seen and the unseen. It was just such an observation that led me to treating people outside the confines of my physical office. Through the years, I came to see that if I took them out into the wilder, less controlled dimensions of nature, if I took them out there, they tended to get better. I came to this treatment strategy when my tribal elders told me that there was no instance of schizophrenia in the indigenous tribes of North and Mesoamerica when Columbus arrived. Working with that proposal, the recovery of my patients with schizophrenic-like symptoms through participation in nature-based community has not only been encouraging, but a signpost for the healing of the split of mass and energy. Persistent immersion in the ecofields allows the split mind of our mad culture to take steps toward wholeness. But I digress a moment from Einstein. Einstein proved that the principles of conservation of mass and conservation of energy are part of the same larger unified principle, the conservation of mass dash energy. Matter can be turned into energy, and energy can be turned into matter. We can just look at this in a sixth grade experiment. This is a match. This is a mass. This is a collection of molecules in a matchstick. So when I strike it, it becomes another form, and yet it is unified, as only Einstein was able to tell us. Let's look a little deeper into E = mc squared. Just briefly, stay with me now, just briefly. E is energy. Energy can neither be created or destroyed. It can only take a different form. That's what I just showed you. For example, the wood I showed you of the mass, of the match, has potential energy, and you can turn it into thermal energy when it is burned. That's E. M is mass, and mass is generally defined as the amount of matter in an object. But what is C? C is the speed of light in a vacuum. The speed of light is used as a constant because if you transformed an object into pure energy, that energy would be moving at the speed of light. It is squared because of the basic properties of energy, namely, an object moving twice as fast as another object actually has 4 times the energy. Realize then that mass and energy are equivalent. The equation states that mass and energy are the same thing and tells you how much energy is contained inside a certain amount of mass. Essentially, the equation explains that a small amount of mass is full of a large amount of energy. And next month, we will look at the implications, the ethical implications of the splitting of an atom. Now, consider a famous analogy of the trampoline in considering the space-time continuum and how it relates to the attractor force and how gravity works in this new paradigm that Einstein is presenting to us. Imagine for a moment that you are standing on the edge of a trampoline, which represents space and time. Then you step onto the trampoline and your mass, the weight of your body, makes an indentation in the trampoline. And in that moment, you can realize mass bends space. Now, imagine that there is a small golf ball on the trampoline at the edge of the trampoline. And as you, as a heavy human being, stand on the trampoline, the ball rolls round and round and round until it comes towards your feet. Notice that I have now introduced Einstein's theory of gravity into the space-time continuum. Next month, we'll explore the general theory of relativity using this trampoline analogy. It is enough today for us to see that energy in the form of your decision to step out onto the trampoline integrates with the mass of your body to make an indentation in the trampoline, which is an indentation in the space-time continuum. Now, imagine that a friend lighter than you stands on the other side of the trampoline and makes another indentation. Notice that the trampoline now has an indentation here and an indentation there. Time does not travel in a straight line going like that. Time skips over the valleys to the tops of the 2 indentations. Thus we can say, mass tells space how to bend. That is, your body makes an indentation on the trampoline. Then space tells matter how to move. We move onto the trampoline, then the indentation tells us how to move. And it skips like a child skipping along, waiting for Christmas to come on Christmas morning. And what is time anyway? Einstein once wrote, quote, "When you're courting a nice girl," I'll pause there and say this is in pre-politically correct language. When you are courting a nice girl, an hour seems like a second. But when you sit on a red-hot cinder, a second seems like an hour. That, said Einstein, is the relativity of time. Now, I want to circle back to the soil out of which the special theory of relativity grew, namely a nature-based networks of friends at Einstein's first job. We all know that he traveled to the Swiss city of Bern to take a job at the patent office. We all know that the character of this work allowed his mind to escape academia and enter the domain of creativity through the patents of creative people that came across his desk. We all know that. We read that in Isaacson. We read that in other places. But what is little explored, even by Isaacson, is the nature-based quality of Einstein's life when he was in the city of Bern. Shortly after Einstein moved there, he began tutoring Maurice Solovine for the price of 3 francs per lesson. A third person, Conrad Habitat, also sought Einstein's help with physics. Both Solovine and Habitat were 20 years old, and Einstein was a ripe old 23 years. Soon the boundaries between students and teacher disappeared, and they began to refer to themselves as the Olympic Club. The Olympic Club was characterized by 2 qualities. One was an intense Socratic dialogue. The second was the fact that most of their discussions were held outside the city of Bern, into less human-controlled areas. They were given to long hikes, were these young men. And I mean really long hikes. A typical hike was 18 miles one way to the untamed regions of Lake Thun. Lake Thun is a glacier lake surrounded by snow-covered peaks of the Swiss Alps. You can go there and Google that and get some really, really beautiful pictures. Sometimes these young men in their early 20s would build a fire and gaze into its mysteries as they discussed Albert's thought experiments and theories of motion. Sometimes they would hike so far they'd have to take a train back to the city of Bern. Other times they would camp out under the stars and speak of the intersecting light of the fire of their campfire with brilliant stars overhead. Later, the club expanded to include Einstein's romantic interest, Mileva Merrick, a young woman who would later become Albert's wife. She was a whiz at mathematics. Let me make a daring proposal to close my part of our time today and open the door for discussion in a few moments. Here are the daring proposals, at least daring to me. Could it be that the web of ecofields surrounding the quaint city of Bern reached out to Albert? Could it be that this untamed region of Switzerland spoke to him in the language that his family and friends thought of as garbled? Could it be that the wisdom of Lake Thun and its icy waters moved and penetrated the pores of Albert's skin? Could it be that the crashing waves at the edge of the lake, this icy lake, spun off negative ions within the electromagnetic field? Negative ions so necessary for creativity and an imaginative mind-brain of the Olympic Club. Could it be said that the special theory of relativity was not the result of a solitary genius, but rather the offspring of a small nature-based community of 4 people and all the living creatures and the clouds and the wind and the snow-covered mountain? Could it be said even that the special theory of relativity was actually the brainchild of a glacier lake? Einstein himself may have had such a proposal in mind when he wrote these words, quote, "Look deep into nature, and then, and only then, will you understand everything better." Then he wrote, "Our task must be to free ourselves by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty." And then he wrote, "He who can no longer pause to wonder and stand in rapt awe of nature is as good as dead. His eyes are closed." And then he wrote, "We still do not know 1,000th of 1% of what nature has to reveal to us." Next month, we will explore the general theory of relativity, as I mentioned. We'll explore the emergence of a new quantum physics so radically different that Einstein himself froze in his tracks and refused to enter that room. We will explore how he became a defender of his paradigm rather than a creator of a new paradigm. We'll explore his friendship with David Bohm. We will explore a train trip across North America that changed his life forever. We will explore his conscious practices, mostly overlooked by his biographer. And finally, we will explore how the new physics joins hands with shamanic wisdom to offer us a pathway into what Einstein himself called the religion of the future. So I think that's enough for today. I'm tired of hearing my own voice. So let me click over to Jim and we'll go from here.
Oh, wow, Will, that was a masterpiece. We often think of Einstein simply in terms of his equation, equals mc squared, and we forget the deep humanity of the man and what he had to fight through in his own day to get to the obvious. And so thank you so much for that discourse, because I think Einstein, must surely rank as, if not the wisest individual of the 20th century, one of the giants, literally, of Western civilization and indeed human civilization. And you read part of it, but I just happened to have it open. And so I thought it might be worth just giving a few other sentences that were attached to one of your quotes. He said, "A human being is part of the whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." Mm-hmm. And I think the comment that I would make to your discourse is that what Einstein said is, in fact, wasn't new. The Buddha, 2,500 years before Einstein, came to virtually the same awareness about the true nature of reality. And that is why Einstein called Buddhism the religion of the future. Because unlike the Western Abrahamic and Greco-Roman philosophical traditions, the Buddha was the one that understood what physics is now indicating, that at the inside of all material reality is simply emptiness. And that emptiness is like E equals mc squared, even as time and space and energy and matter are two sides of the same coin. The way the Buddha framed it in the Heart Sutra, it's worth reading. He said, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is no other than form. Form is no other than emptiness. And what we explored actually in the week we just had on wisdom in the new civilization, is I was trying to give a perspective on your notion of the mother tongue and the larger eco field, is the very deep Buddhist awareness that unless you see the relativity of all things, time in relationship to space, energy in relationship to matter, the fact that the visible world emerges out of the invisible world, you can't get a hold on any kind of meaningful ethics. And I think that would be where my question to you would be, just out of this observation, which I think was in some ways the great challenge to Einstein. I don't want to say the great mistake, but remember, it was Einstein that sent the letter to Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, to use those equations to develop the atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Mm-hmm. In contradistinction to that, the Buddha taught that emptiness is the cradle of compassion, and that when you truly immerse yourself into this equation of, as we would call it, E equals mc squared, what naturally comes forth is a disposition of compassion. And that's why Buddhist countries, and in particular Tibet, have evolved into sort of non-violence zones over time. And I would love your comment on this, because I think, it's as Madhu, for example, on this call comes from a Buddhist country. And we tend in the West to hold up Einstein as if he discovered something new, which he certainly did in comparison to the Western Judeo-Christian metaphysical framework. But to the Eastern tradition, this has been the basis of their civilization for several thousand years. And I think it's important for us to be aware of how Einstein, in his own way, to your beginning and concluding point, he wasn't really discovering anything. He was really remembering, becoming aware of a very deeply ancient truth that many people, thousands of years ago, including many of the indigenous people, knew to be true just simply because of the intuitions that they had into a living universe and a unified field theory. So that would be my comment and question, that in one culture, that awareness led to an atomic bomb, and to another culture, it led to a culture of compassion. And what would be your comments on that?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Thank you for your kind and insightful words as well. Yeah, in some ways you could say Buddha anticipated this paradigm you're talking about, and Einstein and Carl Jung that I was talking about last year were, in my way of thinking, the two pivotal figures of the 20th century, linking the old civilization that we now call a global civilization that is currently running the culture, but link out to the civilization that will have to emerge if we as a species are to survive. Mm-hmm. So here's how I see Einstein gave us something that Buddha didn't. Einstein started with matter and showed us energy and its link. Buddha started over on the other side of spirit and linked us to matter. Now, you and I have you and I have discussed this before, but we'll bring this out into the group. See, I think both Einstein and Buddha struggled as humans in putting this together. And we'll discuss in greater detail next month Einstein's struggle with his own ethical moorings in terms of his participation in the splitting of the atom. But Buddha also struggled with it, because while he advocated balance and the middle way, he also had a deep suspicion of the material world through samsara, right? So even though he was really bringing these together in a way that was far advanced, in some ways that has also fed into the global civilization in a suspicion of the sensual, as David, what's his name, puts it. So I don't want. Yeah, I don't want to idealize either of these men. I think they were great, great people, but they, like us, were feeling their way along at the edges of consciousness. That's what I get from Einstein. We didn't discuss his marriages. We didn't discuss his conflicts. We'll get into some of that next time. But here's a very human person that was bringing forth an evolutionary impulse at just the time that I believe we needed. But it's taken us 100 years of resistance that he himself struggled with, that we're just now beginning. But one thing I would say for all of us that's encouraging, I'm not sure I understand E = MC squared. I just gave you what I think it means. But all of us understand this perhaps a lot better than his dissertation advisors did. Think of that.
Sure. Yeah.
So in that sense, we're already moving into this new paradigm with some hope.
On that point, I know there are others that want to speak, but on that point, I remember talking with Rupert Sheldrake, and his notion of the morphogenetic fields that once one person makes a breakthrough, like Einstein, against all the resistance, it somehow goes into the collective consciousness, and other people, even at the high school level or here in our call, can find an equation accessible that was completely incomprehensible and in his own times, such that only he could see it. Yes. Now people all over the world can see it, but it was needed for that one person to make the breakthrough.
Right.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. Is Georgie still with us? Does Georgie want to make a comment or pose a question?
I'm here. Can you
you,
hear me?
hey,
Okay.
you deserve a pastry for hanging in there into the night.
Well, I think there is a lovely lady who must be much more tired than I am. So, but first of all, I would like to say a big thank you to you, Will. I'm never tired listening to your presentation. It's always really, really awesome. Well, I have lots of things to say that maybe some of them I can leave it to your next lecture, because as you were talking, I was thinking about metaphysics and consciousness, and then how matter is an informed energy, and so maybe we can talk about it next time. But a few things I would like to make a comment on. I didn't know much about Einstein's childhood and his upbringing, and he struggled to find a decent university. If there was a wisdom school that time, you see, he would have had a much easier way to get into for a PhD. But anyhow. It was really interesting to hear that how his schooling was so different to others, and how schooling wasn't limiting his creativity, and possibly his parents weren't limiting his creativity either. Mm-hmm. And also, just to segue back to what Jim Garrison, you said, the comparison and the differences between Buddha's and Einstein's message. I think that these two wonderful people's languaging were different to different people. Like Buddha was for the spiritually minded, mm-hmm. and Einstein was for the science-minded people. So I think that the message inherently, in essence, are the same, but they're talking to different audience. Mm-hmm. And before I joined the call, I was thinking about Einstein, and one of his quotes, well, actually what you quoted, Jim, is on my website. I love this so much. But the other one I love so much is when he said that life is like riding a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving. Mm-hmm. And I like it so much because in this sentence, there's so much there. And you can really dissect every single word. Well, the two words I really like so much is balance and moving. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean, balance? Really, that in our life, it's almost on a daily, momentary basis. We have to attain that balance. Balance comes from the spiritual, the intellectual, the emotional, the physical, etc., etc., and the moving. So the moving, that could be evolution, isn't it? Moving has to be evolution. Everything really changes around us. Yet the human psyche is so opposed to change, isn't it? We really like our routine. We don't really want to change, yet everything around us is based on change, isn't it? Mm. So I'd like to ask you, Will, that what do you think about this, that balance and moving, what Einstein said?
Yeah, thank you, Georgia, for those insightful questions and comments. Yes, I was, as you were talking, I was thinking about this balance. First of all, it's very difficult for me, to continue the spiritual practice of motion, because I had this match, and see, it's very difficult to say this match is in motion, but it is. And so it's so contrary to common sense and critical reasoning that it's like a Buddhist koan. It's like it turns our whole perceptive ability. So that's one thing I would say. And then another thing is the balance between sense and soul, between science and art. So Buddha was definitely over on the spirit side, and reached over into the material side. And Einstein was over on the material side of mass and reached over, and he just dabbled a little bit over in this other side. And we'll talk a little bit more of that next month. But I really invite everyone who has the capacity to come with us to our trips to Teotihuacan, because we have the Toltecs, who likely were 300 or 400 years before Buddha, who also had this balance, and their whole paradigm was the integration of science and art, or science and soul. So one of the things the Buddha didn't have is the equations, right? That's what Einstein brought us. But the Toltecs had the equations. And we don't have fully how they used them because of the role of the church coming in and Western civilization doing away with a lot of that. But I think where we can find this balance you're talking about in our own life is really the central challenge of attending the seeds of a new civilization.
Are there other, we have 19 participants. Are there any folks with questions for Will? We have about 10, 15 minutes left. Dan, refresh everyone's memory about how to ask a question.
Anybody can hover over the top part of their Zoom window, and there's a little hand there. Click on the hand, and we will call on you.
It's only 3:30 a.m. in Sri Lanka, everyone. Antoine. Oh, there we go. Lily Roughton put her hand up. Lily. Can you open her line, Dan?
Yes.
I'm loving this conversation.
Okay. Lily.
One of the things I was really concentrating on was when you were talking about Buddha and Einstein, and you were talking about science, and Georgie was mentioning science and religion and spirituality. I was thinking about, when are we going to touch into the non-duality? When are we going to put those two together? Another thing that came up, Jim, that you were talking about was how he had this brilliant concept, this idea, and then he was ahead of his time. But he sets a foundation for another brilliant idea, and another brilliant idea. And there we grow, and Georgie's evolution takes place. So I've really been enjoying this whole conversation. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Always good to see you, Lily.
And you.
By the way, everyone, Lily is working with Will to develop a spiritual mentorship program through our Wisdom School and Ubiquity University that's really based on this notion of the larger eco field. And so if anybody's interested in pursuing it, please be in touch, because the implications of what Will is setting forth today through Einstein in terms of the larger eco field is quite profound. And up until very recently, almost all spiritual direction, at least in the West, has been based on a particular religion or doctrinal understanding of reality. And what we're seeking to pioneer here at Ubiquity University through the Wisdom School is the notion of a spiritual mentoring, a spiritual direction, as it's sometimes called, predicated on, emptiness and form and the larger eco field, out of which a sense of alignment with the larger whole frames our lives in a profoundly different way than the dualistic thinking that we've inherited from the past. So, Lily, thank you so much for everything you're doing on our behalf. She's one of our alumni, wrote a masterful dissertation several years ago. So it's always good to hear you and see you.
Thank you. And you.
So
anyone else? Let's see. Who else do we have here? Jonathan, are you with us? Or is Madhu still up? Victoria. Well, if there are no questions, we're about at the top of the hour. Anyway, I want to just make a couple of announcements. The first is that I'll be sending out the recording of last month's lecture, which was my second lecture on Plato's Republic. And then probably within a week, Dan will have the recording of Will's lecture today, and we'll post those on both the website and also on the Facebook page. I want to encourage all the students, and indeed all of you who are auditors as well, to participate on the Facebook page. For the students, it's required for your grading and to get credit. So this is a very important aspect. You know, we hear from our various lecturers once a month, and then it's very important to delve very deeply into the book in question and then interact. And I was going to suggest, Will, that maybe Dan, you can post Will's questions, or Will, you can post the questions on the Facebook page that came up at the beginning of this call, and then we'll all respond as we can. But it's very important that we have communication with each other between our monthly calls, because these are deep issues. You know, what Einstein was grappling with is still shaking the foundations of the world's understanding of itself and the cosmos. So, you know, Plato's Republic, 2,500 years later, is still shaking the foundations of the world philosophical traditions. Excuse me, the Apology. I lectured on the Republic last year, the Apology this year. So that's important. So we will take a break now. We'll reconvene the second Tuesday of April, where Will once again will conclude his remarks on Einstein, and we'll have then further discussion through our Facebook page. So Will, thank you. You're brilliant. Your mind, you have a beautiful mind, man. And I'm always deeply, deeply inspired. So thank you all, and we'll see you within a month.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Look forward
Bye-bye.
to again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Georgie.